Hello friends, for today's video I want to do a non-spoiler review for what has not only been one of my favorite books I've picked up this year, but one of my new favorite fantasy books ever. It was absolutely incredible, really epitomizes the idea of being transformative within the genre while still paying homage to a lot of what the genre takes inspiration from, and that book would be Talonsister by Jen Williams. There's a lot to get through, so I'm going to have timestamps and chapters essentially where we have a formal synopsis for this, and then we'll segue into some things that have to do with sort of the accessibility of this book and how it has come out currently, the current landscape of fantasy, because of course books don't come out in a vacuum. And I do have a couple of things to note about this author's career in general and what they are offering the genre, and how I feel like so many of us are not only missing out on it, but I also find that a lot of us want more fantasy like this, and it's right here. It's just so incredibly underhyped, and it deserves so much more attention. Before I jump into those things, though, if you are interested in that section of this, I'll have the timestamp so you can skip ahead. But if you are somebody who typically doesn't want to hear too much ahead of time, of course, like I said, this will be spoiler-free. But even still, I know for some people, I myself am this way, I like only having some breadcrumbs to pique my interest. And this is myself for you, if you are that person who just wants the breadcrumbs. If you like absolutely incredible lore, if you like animal companions, mythological creature companions in your stories, and if you like something that has absolutely awesome magic and how everything is woven together, is unexpected, and you just keep finding yourself going, oh, that's really cool, oh, that's really cool. If you're somebody who likes that within your fantasy stories, already I can tell you that this one is probably gonna work for you, or at least I hope it does. And on top of all of that, I'll give a couple of comp titles, which are of course not perfect, but these things came to mind while I was reading it. One of them came to mind right away in the prologue, which would be, it's almost like if you combined Princess Mononoke and Elden Ring. And immediately after picking up this book, I immediately jumped into its sequel. It is just a duology, and I can say the things that brought Elden Ring to mind for me, I would say, are especially present in the second book, but there's just so much about this that is phenomenal. So we'll go ahead and segue now into a formal synopsis. If you want to skip through this part so that you don't have too much information, what I just said was enough, then feel free to skip ahead to the accessibility portion of this and the commentary on this and fantasy as a whole. But officially jumping into the synopsis. Right as soon as the story kicks off, we see a young infant that has clearly been abandoned in some way. There is a dead body nearby. A group of griffins come upon this infant. A duo of griffins come upon this. Typically, griffins want nothing to do with humans. They think less of humans, but they decide to take this child in. From there, you don't really know exactly what has transpired in the meantime, but you segue 16 years later and you are introduced to a number of different perspectives. Every single perspective that is introduced, you can clearly see the way that they all are connected at least a little bit, but they all have their own plot lines that immediately build an incredible amount of intrigue and suspense. It is well paced in how it goes between these different perspectives. It's really fantastic in how each perspective allows you to get introduced to more pieces of the world. And not just that, but this is really well balanced between there being those personal things the main characters care about, and thus they almost have their own individual antagonists, while also there being this greater arc that is likely going to, you feel like anyway, unite them in some fashion. One thing that this book did incredibly was it kept me guessing so much. And in a lot of fantasy books nowadays, especially if you're really familiar with fantasy or if you're really familiar with certain authors, you can actually start to pick up on specific authors' ways of foreshadowing, or in general, you get so accustomed to picking up on just how foreshadowing is accomplished overall that sometimes things can become predictable. And I was very pleasantly surprised because I really thought I knew certain things while I was reading this, and I was slightly incorrect about some things, and then other things, because you have almost this mystery occurring over the course of the story, because of that, you get so swept up in trying to piece together what's going on there that there are other things that you are completely unaware of, and it is fantastic. I absolutely love that feeling. A little bit more though about the other perspectives and the world itself. One of the perspectives is an individual named Levin. Levin has clearly fought within wars and was used as a weapon of the Imperium. The way that she is used as a weapon is that she has what are essentially like tattoos, these pieces of ore that have been put along her body, and this allows her to access power. And this comes from the bones of these amazing beasts that are mostly dead within the world now, known as Titans. As for what Titans are, they are essentially these magical, mythological creatures that all used to exist within the world, but most of them have died out. And their reasons for having died out are things that are slightly a mystery to you as the reader. It's also not particularly well known and documented by a lot of the people within this world, but they utilize the remains of the Titans to try and enhance certain individuals. For each of the people like Levin that had this occur, they are referred to as heralds, and within the Imperium, they are seen as heroes, but to everyone else across the world, especially those who were conquered or fought against the Imperium, they are seen as absolutely despicable, the worst of the worst. There are additional consequences, though, to having this done to yourself. For one, everything that occurred before this was actually forgotten. So you see a lot of these heralds no longer have their memories, and within Levin's first perspective, one of her former war buddies is starting to feel like something's happening, that their memories are potentially coming back, and they're not sure if it's their memories or if it's something else, but it doesn't feel right. And Levin herself is finding certain things are occurring, and she's determined now that she is basically free of war, of the commands of the Empress. She wants to try and discover a little bit more about perhaps the memories that she lost. Through this, you are then introduced to another perspective, who is a spy for the Empress. This is somebody who lurks within the shadows, has a great deal of knowledge, and they are tasked with wiping out anybody who might reveal the secrets of the Imperium to other individuals. And this person is then tasked with a quest to try and find more Titan bones, the remains of some of the Titans that might have actually never existed, but within certain documents, it seems like there's a chance that there were other Titans out there. And so he has to work alongside this horrible woman who is an alchemist and who is somebody that has had the ability to graft Titan bones into people's skin. They are going to go on this expedition. Throughout the course of that particular perspective, there are actually a decent amount of horror elements where mysterious things are happening. It does seem like the place they're going is dangerous and kept away from for a reason, but what that reason is, you actually find yourself desperately wanting to know, and it almost feels like this descent into darkness where you are trying to piece together the lore that you have, as well as all of the things that the characters are informed of, and you're trying to see and differentiate what's truth from fiction, and also use what's right there in front of you and what is currently transpiring to see if you can piece everything together. The other main perspective you're introduced to is somebody who has a strong connection to this wild forest, and within this forest, individuals who dedicate themselves like this person does become rangers, and the forest gifts them with certain powers to communicate with animals to some degree, to almost even communicate with the woods themselves, the plants, and have some capabilities where they can essentially ask and request things of animals and the forest. What they cannot do, though, and the line they cannot cross, is that they cannot impose their will onto the forest or the beings of the forest. And if they do, they go Thrawn, which is essentially meaning been rejected by the forest and they will be exiled from it. So this other perspective is somebody who is very incredibly dedicated to the forest. One of the last remaining bear titans actually exists within this forest, and they all really come together to adhere to his will, to listen to him, to respect him, and this particular Titan has tasked this character with essentially babysitting our Herald character who comes here to try and figure out a little bit of her past. Likely already there's so much about this and so many individual components that sound really fascinating, and I know for myself, every piece of world building that I got, every new little bit of information, I was latching onto and I could not get enough of. It was one of those stories where as I was reading it, I was finding myself sad at the idea that it is only a duology, because I would love so many more stories to be written within this world. I couldn't get enough of it, and because of how well crafted the lore is, it's also one of those things where you think, I don't even just need to exist within this world around this time period. Just drop me in any time period in this world and I'll be happy, which I think is a very good indication of how fantastic not only the history of the world is, but how it's incorporated into present day, where you're not only engaged in the present day plotline, but you then could see yourself enjoying pretty much any moment that the author might choose to write a story within. It's amazing. I just love fantasy where you can sink your teeth into worlds like this. And as far as how the world building is delivered, I have the absolute most minimal, I wouldn't even say it's criticism. It was just one of those things where it's slightly noticeable, where pretty early on with two of the perspectives, they do kind of have a let's relay the information, that way the reader can know what's going on. And I know for some people, they actually really appreciate fairly clear-cut, these are details about the world. They actually kind of appreciate moments like that, so they don't have to be too in the dark and feel like they have to reread everything. But it did stand out the tiniest bit, only 2 times early on, where it felt like maybe the information was delivered a little bit on the nose. But when I say that that's pretty much one of my only things to point out, I mean, I really truly mean it. There's just so much about this that is so unlike anything else, while also feeling like pieces of all these other things. And interestingly, the only other story that I felt like this reminded me of was a different story by the same author, which goes to show just how kind of in a league of her own Jen Williams is when it comes to fantasy. If you don't know, the other series I'm referring to is the Winnowing Flame series, one of my favorite trilogies of all time, so surprise, surprise that I ended up liking this as well. But if you have checked out Winnowing Flame, that series is more sci-fantasy, this is more fantasy. And I loved both. I think she utilized both fantastically, obviously, given that I just am continuously talking about how I thought it was so amazing. But truly, there were only a couple of times where I thought, oh, this kind of reminds me a tiny bit of something that was in this other series by the same author. There aren't too many other authors that I think do this, where you really can only come to find that they remind you of themselves. And I wouldn't say, just to be clear, that it was one of those things where it felt like she just took the same blueprint from Winnowing Flame and copied that. It's not anything like that. It was just kind of I feel like maybe I can see where this author's mind likes to settle into these types of things. Like, for example, the fact that mythological creatures feel like a thing that is not only ingrained in her stories, almost like she can't resist having them, but how she utilizes them and how she brings them to life is very different than what I see in most other stories. It doesn't feel like she's doing the same exact thing. Again, there are, what I said at the beginning, aspects to the world building that feel like they're paying homage to certain pieces of our own world's folklore, but at no point do I feel like it is ever feeling like a copy and paste of not only lore that exists within our own world, but also what other fantasy books have done. It always just feels very unique to Jen Williams. Also, I mentioned a little bit ago the way that it keeps you on your toes and it keeps you guessing, and that was such a great feeling. There were things that I could tell I wasn't 100% right, but I was like, I feel like there's something here. And I also feel like I'm supposed to think there's something here. So am I being tricked? Is this a red herring? Or am I onto something? And is it obvious or is it not? And so I like when you are second guessing and then it feels like the author kind of outsmarts you or distracts you. I really like that feeling. I do want to note as well, by no means is this in my opinion, thematically driven story, which oftentimes those are the ones that get the gut punches. Those are the ones that make you sit back and reflect. But that does not mean that there aren't thematic elements woven into each of the individual characters' arcs and plot lines. And that's something that I think is hard to accomplish because oftentimes I, for example, quite liked Blood Over Brighthaven. That book is not hiding even a little bit what it's trying to say. And it's also certainly it's present within the characters' plot lines, but of course it is because that is sort of the whole purpose. And I think it's difficult to balance out characterization and not have them feel like just these empty vehicles to insert movement for the thematic elements. And I do think that in the other story I'm mentioning, it was accomplished well, but at the end of the day, it is very thematically driven. Here, it feels like it's slightly more plot driven, but I by no means felt like the characters had nothing to them. They certainly all have distinct personalities. I like their interactions. I also thought that they stood out as individual characters, whether it be through the experiences they've had in their lives, which inform how they think and how they behave or how other people treat them, their backgrounds as far as how they've been treated by other people around them? Do they come from royalty? Do they come from nothing? Do they not know what they come from? And then you have characters that, of course, there are pieces of magic that play a role in their lives. So I certainly felt like they all had their own distinct voices, their perspectives all stood out because of them as individuals, and then their interactions, seeing how characters interact with each other, was really well accomplished. But all of that to say, I felt like the plot and the characters were really well paced, and how the thematic elements tied together with that was great. Because, for example, you have the character Levin, who was previously a soldier, and she oftentimes, especially given she's lost her memories before a certain point, she kind of just repeats a lot of the things that have been fed to her by the Imperium. She just is like, oh yes, we brought upon these other lands the blessings of the Imperium. And then other characters will confront her like, what happens if we don't want your so-called blessings? You just slaughter us. That's not, don't you hear yourself? Don't you realize that you are just a tool for them? So you'll see little pieces like that, where I wouldn't say that the whole point of the story is that thematic piece, but it's woven into that character's perspective. And then you get the character who's very connected to the woods. And you see also, I didn't even mention all the politicking that goes on in this world, but there's great politicking that happens as well. But that character obviously cares very much about the conservation of this forest and not wanting other people to come and take from that and to destroy it. So you could see there's almost like the conservation aspect of certain themes within his plotline. So there's a lot of different things that feel true to the characters, and I feel like that is very hard to accomplish, that perfect, we gotta balance thematic elements, we gotta balance the plot, we gotta balance the characterization, and it was all done incredibly. Everything came together so seamlessly, in my opinion, at least. Of course, there are mythological creatures. Am I always going to have a soft spot for these? Yes, I am. I love when there are mythological creatures in fantasy. Part of me sometimes, a little bit, I'm like, how could you not? They're one of the best parts of, talking about magic systems, setting those aside, because I know for a lot of people, that's what they like, is they like the magic in a fantasy world. For me, I'm like, give me the creatures, give me the different kinds of beings. That's what I want to see so often, and especially if it's done well. Because, of course, I'm a sucker for a dragon. It doesn't take much, I'll admit, it doesn't take much. If you throw a dragon or some cool creature in a story, I'm going to be a little bit more interested. But that doesn't mean you immediately get a pass just because they're there. And Jen Williams just always raises the bar when it comes to how cool they are, they're almost their own culture, and how they interact with humans. That's the question I feel like you have to ask when you're going to incorporate those into your fantasy stories, is how do they incorporate with humans? Are they allies? Are they enemies? Are they not wanting anything to do with each other? How do they play a role? And what about different ones? Do they have, at any point, allyship with each other? Did they war with each other? Do they stay away from each other? And she asks all these questions, and then she puts that all there for you to not only determine as you go along, but also you have to try to sometimes glean information based off of pieces of things that you get. Not to mention that just the creativity behind how she does the Titans in these stories, of which sometimes they're griffins, sometimes they're bears, sometimes they are wyverns, and all sorts of different creatures. How she has that embedded into the story is fantastic. I told you it was just going to be a gush review because this book was so good, and I want so many more people to read it. And on that note, we have to talk about the accessibility of this story, because unfortunately, just like what happened with Winnowing Flame, it is not the most accessible. A little backstory with my history with Jen Williams' books. I mentioned the Winnowing Flame a bit ago. The first book of that trilogy is called Ninth Reign. I picked up Ninth Reign on a whim a few years ago, thought it was absolutely incredible, and was floored at the lack of hype that book had, because I thought, man, this is what so many of us are looking for in our epic fantasy, in our sci fantasy, and I really feel like so many people are going to love this, and I loved it. So I talked about it a lot because I thought it was truly so incredible. I read books 2 and 3. I was falling in love with those as a whole as well, so copy and paste everything I just said. Continuously talked about how great it was, how much I loved it. And in talking about it so much, a lot of you wanted to check it out, and then it was kind of brought to my attention that there is a lot of accessibility issues with that trilogy. This is as a result of regional restrictions. The publisher is a UK publisher, so you mostly see it printed in the UK. Thus, if you want to have it delivered to where you live, if you happen to live outside the UK, you have to have it shipped from retailers that even have access to doing that. And then you also run the risk of not only having to pay more money, but also the books arriving damaged. That's another thing. Or not arriving at all, because sometimes things get lost along the way. So that was very frustrating for a lot of people. But a lot of people are like, okay, well, digital copies exist, except for there's regional restrictions on digital copies as well. So, for example, if you're somebody who prefers audiobooks, you didn't want to risk spending a lot of money and potentially having damage on a physical book. If you have visual impairments and it's just easier to listen to audiobooks, a lot of people figured they would go that route. And then it turned out the regional restrictions apply to the audiobooks as well. So I've actually never listened to the audiobooks for the Winnowing Flame trilogy as a result of that. And I didn't even know they existed because they wouldn't even show up when I was curious about checking out the audiobooks for those. So it wasn't until I had really started talking about how much I love the series that people really came to realize all this, and then I came to realize this. And so many people were talking about, well, how do I get my hands on this series? That it prompted, apparently, I know this because other people sent it to me, a tweet from Jen Williams saying, why are there so many people suddenly interested in buying my books? What's going on? And a bunch of people were like, oh, there's this booktuber that won't shut up about them, basically. So that was actually really exciting because of the fact that it really goes to show how much I think all of us can make a difference in an author's career, and how when we don't have to just have whatever are almost like the chosen one books. Because, of course, we all know publishing backs certain books. They put money behind certain books. And they put those books in front of our faces. They're the things that are right at the front of a bookstore. The things that are right on tables, or the things that are face out. And we don't even realize sometimes how much the things that are shown to us, that there is money behind it. So it can feel like you come upon things organically. But sometimes there is this almost like grassroots thing that can occur with books. And so that was really amazing to see that so many people were that interested, that it created enough of a buzz where now Winnowing Flame is more accessible, which is incredible, and it makes me so happy because it deserves it. And you would think after all of that the next series that Jen Williams wrote, that maybe they would make it a little more accessible. And did they? No, they did not. So unfortunately, once again, this duology, which was written after Winnowing Flame, in fact, the second book, Titanchild, of the duology came out just last year. These books, once again, regional restrictions on the audiobooks, and a lot of times they're not going to be as accessible to order from retailers in your area. If they do have them, they likely have to have them shipped in. So it is very frustrating that once again, this is occurring. And I bring all this up not only to give you that heads up ahead of time in case you do want to check it out, because please check it out, it's so good. And also, selfishly, I need to talk to somebody about this series. I'm messaging my friends and I'm like, please update me as you read this, please read this. But selfishness aside, I'm giving you all that heads up. But additionally, I also wanted to comment on the one book by Jen Williams that is fantasy that has recently actually gotten more attention in the US. It's gotten more accessibility, and that would be her YA romantasy story. And I, as many of you know, I read YA books. I read romantasy and fantasy romance. I will check a lot of things out, and I check things out with bias at the door. My way of operating is it's best to go into something and then have your opinions about it, and have the opinions based off of what you're actually checking out. Because a lot of times the people that hate on those other things, certain age ranges and certain genres or subgenres, a lot of times they do it, not always, but sometimes they do it from afar. They do it because of, they hear people roasting sometimes books that, and maybe the people roasting the books are being genuine and they mean it. But if all we ever know about something is based off of rant reviews or based off of what we hear other people say, we don't check it out for ourselves, it can develop into generalizations and sometimes even misconceptions. I think also we saw that when YA became more prominent within age range splits and you started seeing things actually formally considered young adult. This was something that occurred years ago, but what happened was a lot of times authors that were previously sold in adult fantasy sections were suddenly being shelved as YA simply because of something like the gender of the author. So you had classic fantasy authors whose works most of us nowadays would consider to be adult fantasy. For a while, they were just shelved in young adult because there is this sort of almost infantilizing of sometimes certain authors' books. So what irritates me right now about the fact that the only thing that seems to have gotten any kind of traction within US publishing spaces for this author's career, and of course I don't know what's going on behind closed doors, but it irritates me that we're only putting forth and kind of putting effort into marketing the one young adult romantasy that this author has written. Because I bring this up because I think something happened similar in Sarah Beth Durst's career. Sarah Beth Durst has written many fantasy books. Queens of Renthia is an entire adult fantasy trilogy. If there was a formal new adult age range, maybe you could say new adult, but regardless, it is a slightly older fantasy series. So you have that trilogy with really cool world building and a really intense forest setting and high stakes, and it's very cutthroat. You also have Race the Sands, which is very different and it has a mother protagonist, and you really, when you go into that story, you do not realize how big the stakes are going to get. She's written quite a number of adult fantasy works. And then she wrote The Spell Shop, which is cozy fantasy. And suddenly, Sarah Beth Durst's name has become known because cozy fantasy is popular. Because cozy fantasy, especially if it has a romantic subplot, is popular right now. So we'll push that out. And then what can happen is that that's all those authors get known for. And again, I really want to emphasize that I don't think there's anything wrong with cozy. I think there's nothing wrong with YA. I think there's nothing wrong with romantasy. However, I don't like when it feels as though we are pigeonholing certain authors into acceptable places, and then we are not actually highlighting all the other kinds of work. I guess to pull a random example here, imagine if, because many of us are familiar with Brandon Sanderson's works, we're familiar with Mistborn, we're familiar with Stormlight. What if the only thing that Sanderson ever got any kind of attention, he's big enough that he pretty much is his own publisher, but let's say he wasn't, and he wrote all these Cosmere books, and he wrote all of this epic fantasy, and the one thing that he gets known for was Tress of the Emerald Sea, or The Rhythmatist, or Skyward. He only got known for those things, and you hardly even knew that the other things existed because there wasn't anything backing it up. What a loss for so many of us. What a loss for fantasy as a whole when you don't show authors with all of their creativity and you only really get to show them in one area. And it also is, it's kind of sad to me because sometimes, and I completely understand where people are coming from, but if somebody, I use the Sarah Beth Durst example, if somebody has only read The Spell Shop and they're like, I didn't really like The Spell Shop that much, so I don't know if I want to check out Sarah Beth Durst's other works. And I'm like, they're really different though. They're really different. And I understand certain authors, they just kind of have an authorial voice that irritates you or you're not a fan of their writing or something. And that's understandable. But when they're writing different subgenres and they're only now getting known for those things because that's what's hyped and popular and that's kind of all marketing will back, it's really limiting. I will definitely check out her YA romantasy story. I want to see how this author does YA romantasy. But I'm going to also continuously get excited about their other works, regardless of whether publishing has hyped it or not. If something stands out to me and I think it's incredible, I will probably want to talk about it continuously. One, because I'm excited about it. Two, because I think a lot of you are going to like it. And three, when it's underhyped and there's a chance that collectively we can make a difference in an author's career, that we can support somebody who is pouring so much into making these incredible worlds for our enjoyment and enrichment in our lives, I am, of course, always going to be excited about that and hype that up. Anyway, this will not just continuously be a, hey, publishing, hey, marketing, pointing and finger wagging, but I'll segue now into just saying, if you are interested in checking out this story, definitely, if you can, please give it a go. I thought it was amazing. I couldn't believe how invested I was. It was like, oh yeah, this is why I love fantasy, which isn't to say that I've read nothing I've liked this year. There have been plenty of things I've liked this year and in years past, but there's just something, it feels like coming home, especially for a lot of us that love fantasy growing up. There's just a way that Jen Williams has with creating fantasy worlds that feels nostalgic in a sense. So I'll have information about this book in the description bar. I'll also continue to hype up the Winnowing Flame trilogy if you've never checked it out, because it's great. But if you have any other authors that you feel like don't get as much attention as they deserve, if there are authors who there are regional restrictions for them as well and you want to shout about them, please do so, because I genuinely appreciate the fact that you're also willing to give me recommendations. I find sometimes great books because of your recommendations, but then also if we can kind of have this loop of I recommend stuff, you recommend stuff, and we kind of collectively can hype authors up, that's great. I think that that's great. So definitely feel free to shout out some other authors that you feel like this is the case for. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.